My videos on prebiotics seem to be among my most popular. With that said, welcome to this video on beta-glucan. I recommend beta-glucan sparingly because the dosing to microbial impact ratio is inferior to a number of other prebiotics. However, it is very well suited to specific goals and should be a part of your daily diet. I see more and more videos online from so-called experts bashing oatmeal and other grains, and to some degree only recommending animal proteins and fats. This is misplaced faith and contrary to so many basic principles. For example, if we look at the longest lived people on the planet, they are not radicalized carnivores. They eat a whole foods diet, which contains cereals among other healthy things. So as you watch this video, keep an open mind, view the data, use common sense, and don't get caught up in dietary fads. Now, beta-glucans can be found in a number of foods. Many of you may appreciate the fact that mushrooms, for example, contain beta-glucans. But we won't be discussing mushrooms, nor some other sources. We'll focus on barley and more specifically oat beta-glucans. Why is that? Because in this video, the data I will present is related to the well-proven benefits of beta-glucans on serum lipids and sugars. These benefits are not at all proven for mushroom beta-glucans and are so well proven for oat and barley glucans that the United States Food and Drug Administration has approved the use of a health claim for the impact of cereal beta-glucan in reducing the risk of coronary disease, and the European Food Safety Authority has approved health claims for cereal beta-glucans related to a reduction in postprandial glycemic responses and total and LDL serum cholesterol. We'll also focus on the benefits of microbial fermentation in your gut. And here too, the fermentative profile is better for oat and barley, in part because the beta-glucan content is significantly higher in these two versus the others. Additionally, oats also contain a fair amount of arabinoxyleins, see my video on this topic, and a little bit of resistant starch, also see that video. Beta-glucans are simple structures composed of glucose. As you can see in A, the structure for mushrooms is different than that in B, which is the linear structure for oat and barley beta-glucan. And although these structures are comprised of glucose, you have to remember, as I keep saying, these simple sugars are not accessible to us. These units of glucose are linked to each other by bonds that our digestive enzymes can't break. However, our microbiome possesses the enzymes necessary to cleave these bonds and then use the freed up glucose for their fuel. Glucose is a pretty universal sugar. Therefore, the bacteria that can consume this particular glucose is a question of which bacteria possesses the enzymes to cleave these bonds. But you have to also remember that it is a question of environment. The best example being pH. Some bacteria can outcompete other bacteria at varying pHs. So although beta-glucan and any other inaccessible sugar are labeled as prebiotics, and prebiotics are defined as contributing to health by feeding good bacteria, this definition is incorrect, as a number of bad actors also possess the enzymatic machinery to access these sugars. So we have to be more intelligent about our approach. In every presentation I do, it's impossible to cover every subtopic. My videos are already long enough. The same is true with beta-glucans. We will not be covering the immunomodulatory benefits of beta-glucans as shown here. Just know that there is data for this, as beta-glucans are able to attach to specific receptors in immune cells and have been shown to do things like inhibit the production of LPS-stimulated inflammation. We also won't cover its antioxidant properties as shown here. But just keep in mind that whole foods are highly beneficial. Foods are not just carbohydrates, proteins, fats, vitamins, and minerals. They possess a vast array of molecules, to include phytochemicals. And when it comes to oats and barley, these phytochemicals are poorly absorbed in our small intestine, and are thus available to fermentation by our microbiome. It is for this and other reasons that the fermentation of oat, and specifically barley, provides anti-inflammatory and specifically antioxidant properties. What we'll spend the rest of our time on are the two well-proven metabolic benefits here, that of beta-glucan's hypolipidemic and hypoglycemic benefits. But first, let's take a look at the connection between the microbiome and beta-glucan, which affects all these parameters and more. So here's a study looking at how 3 different prebiotics can impact the microbiome, one of which is our old friend inulin. For more on that, watch the video dedicated to it. As we can see in red, the beta-glucan increased a number of taxa. There is general consistency in which taxa beta-glucans feeds. For example, here we see increases in bifidobacterium and Roseburia facies, 2 taxa you'll see shortly. But some studies show no microbiome alteration. For this, we should consider dose. For example, the well-established beneficial dose for blood lipids is only 3 grams per day of beta-glucan. But when we're talking about the microbiome, 3 grams is not much in the grand scheme of things. I recommend daily doses of properly blended prebiotics to suit individual needs at much higher doses. Also of note in this study is that all 3 prebiotics significantly decrease something called p-cresol, which is a toxic metabolite of protein fermentation. Again, fermentation of sugars, like glucose from beta-glucan, has been proven to be health-promoting, while fermentation of proteins produces a number of concerning metabolites to include p-cresol. More on that in a later video. In this study, we see different prebiotics used at 2 different pHs. One of these prebiotics is, of course, beta-glucan. The dark green represents a high increase in the abundance of a given taxon. A cursory look at this table shows that there is more dark green at a pH of 5.5 as compared to a pH of 6.5. In fact, the authors go on to state that, quote, interestingly, butyrate formation was influenced not only by the overall percentage of butyrate-producing bacteria in the community, but also by the initial pH, consistent with a pH-dependent shift in the stoichiometry of butyrate production. Again, we're talking about environment. This concept is covered in detail in my video on pH. I highly recommend it. It's a very important concept. If you're familiar with my videos, you know I have already addressed many of these key prebiotics. The fructans here come from inulin. The alpha-glucans here can come from resistant starch. We have arabinoxyleins shown here, pectins here. Galactomannins will be launched in the coming months. A great source for this is partially hydrolyzed guar gum. And our topic for today, we have beta-glucans. They all lead to this thing called pyruvate, which is a more basic unit of fuel after other larger molecules have been broken down. Now this short-chain fatty acid here, propionate, is a fermentation end product of a number of bacteria within the microbiome. And it does have some very good metabolic data. And to some degree, the benefits of beta-glucan are derived from propionate. I'll launch a video dedicated to propionate in the coming months. But as you now know, butyrate is an incredibly beneficial molecule within us. It is the key to this figure. And look who's making it. All of these superstars I'm always talking about in every video. Species from Roseburia, Coprococcus, Anarostipes, Eubacterium, and the true superhero F. prausitzi, and many more, are making butyrate from these prebiotics, to include beta-glucan. Protein is not driving this equation. It is the sugars inaccessible to us, but which are fuel for mostly good bacteria, which drive our health. When I compile all of my data points from every human and humanized in vitro study I could find over the years, as the former director of medical education for a microbiome firm, and now with my own platform, I get this chart here. The taxa which most consistently respond to beta-glucan are species from the genera Bacteroides, Bifidobacterium, Lactobacillus, and Roseburia, and the species E. rectale. Which taxon responds is a question of what the beta-glucan source is, the molecular weight, the pH of the gut, and more. Bacteroides, as listed here as before the reclassification a few years ago, is a very large genus of what we'll say, for the sake of simplicity, consists of passive generalists which aren't the main drivers of disease or wellness. Bifidobacterium is a health promoter with good data. E. rectale is a superstar with excellent data. If you're familiar with my videos, you know by now how I feel about Lactobacillus. And last we see the genus Roseburia, another superstar within the gut. Only one study showed beta-glucan causing a significant decrease in Roseburia, while the rest showed that beta-glucan significantly increased species from Roseburia. So let's take a brief look at it in more detail. You can easily see how when a significant difference was found in a human fecal microbiome study encompassing all of the diseases conditions listed on the x-axis, that the vast majority of the time, Roseburia was significantly higher in the healthy controls as compared to the disease cohort. This is no coincidence. The species from Roseburia, primarily R. feces, R. hominis, R. intestinalis, and R. inulinivorans, are butyrate producers who use sugars as a source of fermentation. These species are among a handful in your microbiome which truly determine your health. And for those species which are opportunistic pathogens, they have a predominance of orange in their charts, something you can see in my presentations. They are the bad guys in charge when you have dysbiosis. Now in this study, when we look at the fermentation viewpoint, we see significant increases in these health promoters here. And we know that these guys are butyrate producers. And one of the many things butyrate does is act as a GLP-1 agonist, which is how Ozempic works. In fact, several studies linked the ingestion of beta-glucans with an improvement in glucose tolerance by increasing GLP-1. And from the same study, the significant increase in butyrate was across the board, as well as the other key short-chain fatty acid with metabolic syndrome benefits, propionate, as we saw earlier. Let's look at other drugs used in metabolic syndrome. Acarbose is a starch blocker that works by inhibiting alpha-glucosidase, an intestinal enzyme that releases glucose from larger carbohydrates such as starch and sucrose. These researchers found that, like acarbose, beta-glucan fibers act as a competitive inhibitor by the nature of their structural similarity to the natural oligosaccharide substrates, which enables them to bind to the enzyme's active site. How about another? The intestinal glucose transporter, SGLT1, is located in the brush border of the small intestine, which transports the glucose released by digestive enzymes from the gut lumen to the intestinal epithelium. Some new diabetes medications target this SGLT1 to delay and reduce the absorption of glucose, especially after meals. While these researchers also showed that beta-glucan fiber impacts SGLT1 transport activity in a dose-dependent manner. Although beta-glucan does increase butyrate producers, as we have seen, it also clearly increases propionate production as well, if not more so, as seen here. The prebiotic beta-glucan resulted in significantly higher levels of propionate as compared to more classic butyrate-producing prebiotics such as inulin, xylins, and pectin, which is what we see here when we look exclusively at butyrate production. This is all a part of choosing your prebiotics wisely at the right doses and blended with other prebiotics suited to the needs of the individual. Now, would I recommend beta-glucan for someone with ulcerative colitis, for example? No. In my protocols, I use other prebiotics which are better suited to the needs of the ulcerative colitis patient. But when it comes to metabolic syndrome, and if more specifically high cholesterol is your concern, then it is a part of the larger equation. Just a brief pause here in the presentation. If you could just hit like and subscribe, it would really help this channel out. Having mentioned cholesterol, this opens up a bit of a can of worms, because in my opinion, the cholesterol numbers are set too low for the profits of the pharmaceutical companies. The bigger concern should be oxidation and inflammation. But I'll take a deep dive into that in my soon-to-be-released video on cardiovascular disease and the microbiome. For our purposes here, we'll just treat cholesterol just as the conventional medical community does. And that being said, truly high cholesterol numbers in the setting of oxidation and inflammation is not a good thing. Speaking of inflammation, here we have a review of 16 papers which looked primarily at beta-glucan and its effects on inflammatory markers. We can see in Table 2 that for healthy people, there were no significant reductions in inflammatory markers. But these were healthy subjects. Does that mean healthy people should not consume oatmeal? Of course not. When they looked at people with metabolic risk factors, we see some nice findings. I've highlighted 3 markers I frequently discuss. You can see how in one paper, CRP was significantly reduced with oats. In another paper, we see LBP, that's LPS binding protein, which binds to the highly inflammatory LPS I always mention. That's a marker for gut permeability and excess gram-negative bacteria. There was no change seen here with the use of barley, which is surprising considering the details of the study. And at the bottom, we see a significant improvement in TNF-alpha, that key cytokine which so many drugs now target. This reduction in TNF-alpha was accomplished with the use of oats, this time in hypercholesterolemic subjects. And not included in the previous review is this paper, using oat beta-glucans. In line with what we saw previously, when considering subjects with a BMI of over 31.5, there were significant improvements in both systolic and diastolic measurements with the oat beta-glucan. Also, insulin parameters were significantly better for those consuming oat beta-glucan as compared to control. Now, the detractors of oatmeal will say that it causes a spike in blood sugar, but that depends on a few factors. One very important one being what form of oatmeal are we talking about? As we see here in Figure 5, both the quick and instant oats cause a significantly higher response than the whole food approach. And this makes sense. Again, we're talking processed versus whole foods. There are multiple studies which have shown that there is a dose-response effect of beta-glucans on the attenuation of postprandial glycemic response. The commonly accepted mechanism of action here is the ability of beta-glucan to increase intestinal viscosity. Viscosity is thickness or stickiness. This is believed to delay gastric emptying and reduce the absorption of glucose by the host. The same viscosity story is true for cholesterol highlighted in Figure 1. The authors state, quote, "The magnitude of serum LDL cholesterol reduction was strongly correlated with estimated intestinal viscosity development, as shown in Figure 1, and provided strong evidence that this viscosity development may be the mechanism of action for the reduction of serum cholesterol levels." So what's going on here is that more bile acids in the gut are trapped by beta-glucan and thus excreted. This means the liver has to make more bile acids to compensate for the losses. And what does the liver make bile acids from? Cholesterol. There is another important factor to consider in relation to cholesterol, and also even for blood sugar. It's the impact of the beta-glucan on the microbiome, and the microbiome's ability to alter bile acid metabolism. For much more on this, I recommend you watch my video entitled Liver Health, NAFLD, and NASH. When the dysbiotic microbiome is improved, we alter the expression of 2 key enzymes which metabolize the bile acids. The first is bile salt hydrolase. The second is the even more crucial 7-alpha dehydroxylase. The altering of these 2 enzymes has huge implications for health, one of which is affecting the type and amount of bile acids which are reabsorbed. Again, affecting cholesterol used to make more bile acids. In the same line of thought, this also impacts 2 key receptors, the FXR and the LXR, which play huge roles in metabolic health. We can see a number of factors at play here in this study with 26 healthy volunteers who underwent a 2-month dietary protocol of just pasta enriched with barley beta-glucan at 3 grams per 100 grams. I highlighted in yellow those markers with significant differences between baseline, that's T0, and 2 months, that's T2. As typically shown in studies, both LDL and total cholesterol were significantly decreased. At the bottom, we see another common finding, significant improvements in blood sugar parameters. Additionally, we see 2 other significant improvements in what are called PCS and FMD. FMD stands for flow-mediated dilation and is considered an index of nitric oxide-mediated vasodilation. This is important and something I'll highlight in my video on cardiovascular disease and the microbiome. Vasodilation is a measure of vascular health, and that's what we're really concerned about. As shown here in Figure 4, we see as a group significant improvements in the ability to vasodilate. This is not just viscosity at work, but also the beneficial effects of the microbiome. PCS stands for p-cresyl sulfate, which is basically the same thing as p-cresol, which we covered earlier. Again, this is a metabolite of protein fermentation. Now, the study did not control for protein changes in the diet. This is a function of improved metabolomic function in the microbiome via the addition of beta-glucan. This has positive impacts on multiple organs to include the kidneys, as you'll learn in a later presentation. Finally, I have 4 points I want to make from this study. 1. In the text, they talk about how there are modest to no changes in studies when using whole grain prebiotics. When looking at the beta-glucan data, I would say that's pretty accurate. Again, the accepted dose is only 3 grams per day. That's not going to drive too much change. But when there is change, mostly good-acting bacteria are increased. Which brings me to point number 2. This study showed that the use of whole grains significantly reduced LBP. Again, that's the protein that binds to the nasty LPS and aids in its disposal. If we have high levels of LBP, then we have high levels of LPS, which means we are dysbiotic and have too much gut permeability. My point number 3 is that the whole grain diet also drove a significant reduction in TNF-alpha. As I always talk about, much of our diseases are centered around inflammation, and TNF-alpha is a prime marker for that. And tied into point number 2, much of that inflammation could be coming from LPS spillover from the gut into the body systemically. The last point is that the authors state that fecal short-chain fatty acids were not altered in the study, like many other studies, due to differences in short-chain fatty acid absorption in the gut. I've been saying for years now that fecal short-chain fatty acid measurements are not a good indicator of short-chain fatty acid production in the microbiome due to these individual differences in absorption. In summary, oats have been cultivated for more than 2,000 years in various regions throughout the world, but only recently have we decided to ruin this health-promoting food. We covered the glycemic index before and how you should choose whole oats over instant, but we should also discuss organic versus not. Organic foods are expensive, and so we have to decide on which foods we want to spend that money. Oats are one of those foods. You may not know that the herbicide glyphosate is not only used to kill weeds, but it's also used for desiccation about a week before harvest. That means to dry out the crop to enhance ripening and improve harvest. So there's a good chance for elevated levels of this chemical in your oatmeal, not to mention a long list of other foods. Another consideration is the amount of oatmeal you need to eat to get the blood sugar and lipid benefits proven out by so many trials. So one must have a realistic strategy to both garner the benefits of the whole food with all of its accompanying proteins, phytochemicals, and other nutrients, while at the same time getting the 3 grams per day of beta-glucan shown to be the magic number in so many trials. But we must also consider the palatability of oatmeal, which in small quantities is fine, but in quantities required to attain 3 grams per day of beta-glucan may be unappealing in the long haul. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video, and I will say that basically every single day on my YouTube comments and in emails, I get a lot of thanks from people out there who really appreciate the information I've been sharing. And so part of that is you're welcome. The other part is you can contribute by clicking on the super thanks below. And if you're not doing a consultation with me and you're not purchasing any protocols, it's a great way to support this channel. Each presentation, depending on the presentation, but most of them take an incredible amount of time to put together. There's a lot of material. There's a lot of data checking. And so it's just sometimes 50, 60, 70 hours to put together one presentation. And so if you can just click that super thanks, I'd appreciate that, and we'll keep the information coming.